Hello. Let's talk about where my podcast lives. The Pharmacist's Voice podcast lives on thepharmacistvoice.com. That's the domain. What we're going to do is just hop on a web browser and we're going to go there now. And I'm going to point out a few things that you will want to know about where my podcast lives. Let's do it. Here we are on thepharmacistvoice.com. If you click on the podcast tab at the top in the center there, it will take you to my podcast website. It does not have its own domain. If you look at the top in the browser, it's thepharmacistvoice.com/podcast. I do also own the domain, thepharmacistvoicepodcast.com, but I don't have it hooked up to this website, just in case you were wondering. Now, some things that you might want to know about this podcast website. This is a WordPress site, and I did not make all this fanciness myself. I paid voiceactorwebsites.com to create this. They make beautiful websites for voice actors. I am no longer in clinical practice. I consider myself more of a pharmacist with a pharmacy background, but more of a voice actor and a podcast host at this point in my career. Voice actor encompasses a whole lot of things. I won't jump into that, but that is why I went with voiceactorwebsites.com instead of somebody else who's just a general web developer. Now, let's talk about some features. I do have a list. If you know me at all, you know that I love lists. So I'm going to go down my list and talk about a few features of this podcast page on my website. I already mentioned that this is a WordPress site. I do update it myself. Voice Actor Websites set it up, showed me how to update it. So every time I'm releasing a podcast episode, I go in here whenever, maybe it's on a Monday or a Tuesday, I release it on Friday. So I schedule the release of all of these posts. Let's click on the most recent one and take a look at some of the features. This is the most recent episode. I'm recording this on Monday, September 19th, 2022. The most recent episode that came out was last Friday, on Friday, September 16th, 2022. How do I know that? Because it's on the podcast player. It's super tiny, but I am circling it with my mouse right now in case you can see it. Now, for this episode, I marked it into a category, which you can see on the right. There is a category called drug name pronunciations. I'm trying to categorize the different types of podcast episodes that I have. I only started doing that this summer, I believe. I don't have a whole lot of them categorized properly. It will come with time. Every time I make a change, it takes me a little while to catch up, but that is a feature. I have an archive. I have been podcasting for 2.5, almost 3 years. And as you can see, I've got an archive that goes all the way till May 2020. That is when this whole website was created, May 2020. If you click on that, you will see that there were already like 20 episodes by the time May 2020 happened. That's neither good nor bad. It's just when I switched from my other website, which I believe was a Weebly.com website, when I switched from Weebly to this WordPress site, the folks at voiceactorwebsites.com had to migrate all my information to this website. So it looks like I published 20 episodes in May of 2020, but I did not. It was just when they all got migrated to this site. If you look on the upper right-hand corner, there's a call to action that says subscribe today. And I do want people to click on these and subscribe. What I've got going on here is 6 buttons to common podcast players. I want to remove one of them. I'm not sure which one, maybe Podcast Addict, and instead include Amazon Music. What I've got here, in case you can't read these, in case you're on a device where it's really small, I've got a button for Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, Podcast Addict, and Stitcher. At the time that I had this website created, those were 6 of the most common podcast apps or podcast players on the market. If you want to have a podcast website, I highly recommend that you make it easy for your listeners to find your podcast. Have at least, the top 4 podcast apps or podcast player links on your podcast website or your podcast page. Now, I have a business with a podcast. If you haven't heard me say that before, I have a business. I have a voiceover business, and part of that business is having a podcast. It is marketing, it's networking, it's relationship building. So my podcast goes on my business website. If that is not the case for you, you have other options. But this is what I did. This is where my podcast lives. It lives on my business website. Here's a great question for you. Why does my podcast even have to be on any sort of a website? The point of having your podcast on a website is to make it easier for listeners to find. Not only do you want them to subscribe to your podcast, but you want them to go look at your episode artwork. If you are a person who creates episode artwork for each episode, you worked hard to make that. Show it off. So it's on your podcast player. It's on your thumbnail image there on your podcast website. Have people be able to look at your episode artwork. And another thing that you just noticed there, I'm sure, is that I have a podcast player on my podcast website. Maybe somebody wants to actually listen to it from their desktop. That's fine. Make it easy for people to listen. And also, as you can probably notice, I have all these words here. What are these words? These are show notes. I put a brief description in my podcast host's description field. That's not the full show notes. Usually, podcast players and podcast apps will cut off after like 500 words or a certain number of characters. So I can put the whole thing here on all the show notes. I can put right here on my podcast's website, my podcast page. Now, some of the things that I do on my podcast show notes, which I'm sure you can pick up on by seeing the clickable links, is I put all of the links that I want people to check out here. I'm making it easy for my listeners to engage with my content. And if you look down here with all these green check marks, I'm making it really easy for people to engage with me on social media. I've got my LinkedIn page, a link to my Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. If anybody's shopping for an audiobook narrator, I've got the link to my audiobook narrator profile on ACX. I'm a narrator for ACX, Audible, and iTunes. And there's all kinds of links. Make sure that you make it easy for your listeners to find your content, listen to it, read it, look at it, all the things. Look at your back catalog, because I guarantee when somebody comes to check out your podcast and they like it, they will want to look, what else has she done? And by having all of it right there in one place and all those attractive images, that clickbait, you've just made it so easy for your listeners to keep listening to your podcast. All right, back to my list here. There's a few other things that I want to mention. There are millions of podcasts out there, and searching for a single podcast can be harder than it sounds. I have my podcast listed under Pharmacist's Voice instead of The Pharmacist's Voice because the number of podcasts that are listed under the word the are many. I don't know how many, but there are many. But there are not as many podcasts that start with the word pharmacist. I am basically making it easy for people to find my podcast by having these podcast players on and having a podcast website. So I just wanted to point that out there. Making a podcast website or having a podcast page on your business site makes it easier for people to find you. Those podcast apps and podcast directories can be mighty hard to navigate. Another reason that my podcast has a website or I have a podcast on my website is that I get what I call Google juice or SEO, search engine optimization value from it. We'll talk about SEO in just a little bit. I'm no expert, but all these words on my website are good for SEO. When I first started this website through voiceactorwebsites.com, I didn't have as much on it as I do now. I started off with 20 episodes. I didn't have different categories. I think I might have had one category and it was podcast. Now I have drug name pronunciations, interviews. It says podcast when it's just general. I need to update that so I can maybe categorize my solo shows as solo shows. I have a button for series. If you click on series, you'll see some of my series, like my back to school series, my pronunciation series, and other series. I am getting better as time goes on. And I bring up these facts because if you wait until everything is perfect, you'll never get started. I want you to see that I didn't wait until things were perfect to get started. I am constantly learning. I am constantly challenging myself to improve my website so that the user experience is better. It doesn't matter if I like it as much as it matters that people are finding me for voiceover jobs. I mean, that's why I have this website. But then also, it matters to me that the user experience is good for my podcast listeners. Because if they hear about something on my podcast from their podcast player and they want to come check it out in my show notes, I need to make it super easy for them to find that episode. So, as you can see, I have all of my episodes numbered. And that is something you might want to think about. Do you want to number your episodes so that people can find it? You're going to have to figure out what you want, but this is how I have things set up. This is where my podcast lives. Two more things before we wrap up this lesson. Number one, I want you to notice how all of my content is branded, meaning my logo's on it. You can see my brand colors, the navy blue and the light blue. Even the buttons are blue. It's all very nice looking. The background is white. There's a good use of white space. So, something to think about as you consider where you want the home of your podcast to be. And the last thing we're going to talk about is domains and hosting. I started off with a GoDaddy domain and I ended up changing to Google domains. For $12 a year, I own the pharmacistvoice.com domain. That's a good deal. GoDaddy initially had me sign up for, I think it was less than $20. And this was back in 2018 or maybe 2017. Along the way, they were hiking up the price. Now, I'm not going to tell you what to do, and I don't mean to talk badly about GoDaddy, but my experience was that they kept hiking up the price, and I was looking at Google versus what GoDaddy was charging, and it just didn't make sense. I have been with Google domains for years. Do your research, decide what you want to do, but I'm very happy for $12 a year to have a Google domain. And the hosting that I have is the same hosting that a lot of voice actors use. It's called Upper Level Hosting. They work a lot with voice actor websites. It was a natural fit for me, so that's who I go with. Now that wraps up where my podcast lives. Let's move on to talking about a website called Podpage.